Greetings, looted wagons, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
This time we're braving the wilds of 4th edition with Codex Orks.
Barbaric and savage, the orcs infest the galaxy from end to end. From the lowliest boy to the mightiest warboss, all orcs live for the moment when they can charge headlong into battle, screaming deafening war cries and firing volleys from their crude but effective guns.
The 4th edition version of Codex Orks is the most recent thing we've covered in this series, what with it being from 2008. We initially weren't going to do a video on it since it seemed too recent, but then we realised that 2008 was in fact 12 years ago, which is just something that happens in your 30s. We're told it only gets worse as the years pass though. So we've got that to look forward to.
But the existential dread that comes from the knowledge that we will all one day be dust aside, this is also a codex that we have a lot more experience with than usual since my orc army was built around this codex back in 5th edition, since it was in use for the entirety of 5th as well. I can still remember the simple joys of using a single custom force field to create a bubble around a fleet of transports to safely deliver countless boys into my enemy's front line by turn 2.
Just as I'm sure Snipe here can remember fighting it.
Oh, I remember! So this episode will be a little bit more mechanically orientated than usual. Not least because from a lore perspective, the orcs in here were more or less the same as their current incarnation, so there's not a great deal to say on that front aside from the background on characters that are no longer in the game. But we'll get to that shortly. Stop rushing us, all you do is sit there and we're not. Although first off we'd like to mention the cover art by Alex Boyd. There's just something neat about this era of covers, with a looser painted style that is more evocative of the chaotic, war-filled, grim-dark future than the modern ones. Well, in our opinion, anyway. Also, this is still when one person was credited with writing the book, and in this case, it was Phil Kelly.
Another thing of note is that although this is a 4th edition codex, it only came out half a year before 5th edition dropped and was valid the entire way through that edition. So we're going to talk about it more in the context of 5th, where it spent the vast majority of its life. After all, they would have known that a new edition was dropping shortly afterwards, so it's likely that it was written with that in mind. Oh, and although we're not really looking at the lore too much in this, we do want to mention that this is the book where the story of the Lost War comes from. The fantastic tale of warboss Grisguts who accidentally went back in time due to warp nonsense and then killed his past self in order to get a spare copy of his favourite gun, with his war collapsing in the confusion afterwards. This same text is still printed with a few minor changes in the current Orc Codex.
So since you've answered our previous wish of giving Ragnar Blackmane a new model, GW, if you're listening, and since I keep sending you those emails, I know you are, please give us a proper short story based on this. One paragraph just absolutely is not enough.
But anyway, the orc units in this book are very similar to the current units, just missing a few bits and pieces that will be added later, like Gorkanauts or their aircraft, although most of the planes were added later on in 5th edition through White Dwarf. It also contains all the special characters we have now, those being Gazkul, Snickrot, Zagstruck, Badrook and Grotsnick. And hell, we even managed to use the correct images on screen this time and everything. I guess Makari is missing, but then he's only just been added back into the game and he's not in the main codex anyway, so he doesn't count. Because I say so. However, there's two special characters in the 4th Ed Ork Codex that are no longer playable. Old Zogwart and Wazdaka Gutsmek, neither of which ever got an official model.
Old Zogwart was the greatest weird boy of all. He was covered in snakes, missing his eyes after a particularly large psychic blast, something he still claims that he meant to do, and was prone to turning his enemies into squigs. This wasn't just a lore thing either, he actually could do it on the tabletop. Instead of a psychic power, you could choose to try and turn an independent character into a squig by both rolling a d6. If you roll higher than your opponent, then the independent character is instantly turned into an angry little squig for the rest of the game. There's a stat line and everything. Although it does specify that you need to supply the squig models, after all, you can't expect every opponent to prepare for such an occasion. If this was still around and I used him, I'd be tempted to make some squigs with appropriately themed hats for whatever opponent I would happen to be facing. Also, as a small bit of trivia, in the current codex, Zogwart is mentioned and is said to come from the planet Zerk, but in the 4th edition one, he came from Catachan. Wazdaka Gutsmek, on the other hand, was the greatest bike boy of them all, riding his tricked out warbike, the bike of the apocalypse. It's like, I knew it, but like, I was reliving it. He also allowed you to take warbikes as a troop's choice, so if you wanted to go full cult of speed, he was a useful addition. The best bit of lore about him is that he once took down a Warlord Titan by ramping off a cliff into its cockpit, catching fire as he passed through its void shields, and murdering the entire crew. To this day, there's still the flamed skulls of the Titan's princeps are mounted on his warbike, a grisly trophy of his greatest kill. which, if you will excuse my language, is rad as heck. Just like Zogwart, Wazdakka is also still mentioned, albeit briefly, in the current Codex.
There was also a small handful of units that are no longer in the current Codex. War buggies, war tracks and big guns are all in here, but in 8th edition they were first relegated to be index only and are now Legends units, and so not really suitable for competitive play. And whilst, as someone who spent a fair amount of time building their own custom versions of all 3 of those units back in the day, I could be mad about it, hey, at least being in Legends means they're still technically playable. When a unit was removed from older editions of the game, you just couldn't use them at all, so at least there's an option now. Similarly, my favourite unit from this codex, the Looted Wagon, is also not available in the current one, but can still be used due to rules published in Chapter Approved 2018, although they're only for use in open play, grumble grumble. Looted wagons, being vehicles from other factions that the Orks have stolen, are a concept that has been around for a while, and the version from this codex was pretty simple. Rather than modify the stat line of whatever vehicle the Orks were stealing, like in 3rd, it just had a generic stat line that you could equip differently. This meant that you could have them as a transport or as a very large gun platform. I preferred the very large gun option. They were unpredictable and prone to randomly charging forward and so losing their ability to shoot, but I loved them. Mostly because the boom gun, as its big weapon was called, was a large pie plate shot that was strength 8 and AP 3, meaning that if it were to, say, land it on a Death Company squad, it'd wound on 2s, ignoring their armour entirely, and because it was double their toughness, it caused instant death, thus nullifying their feel no pain. Also, it used scatter dice, and I just jump at any excuse to use scatter dice. I just think they're neat. But I could talk about my love of this not particularly competitive but occasionally devastating unit that encouraged impressive conversions all day long, and since Snipe is giving me the look, I'll stop talking about it, and leave you with the fact that this is also the codex where killer cans stopped being killer cans and started being killer cans, a thing I'm sure you've spent many a sleepless night wondering about.
But what else could the enterprising Orc player do with this codex? Well, there was a few things. One we mentioned earlier was how a custom force field Big Mech, even when mounted in a vehicle, could make all the vehicles within a 6-inch radius obscured, meaning that you could have blobs of vehicles all with a 4+ cover save, invaluable for getting trucks full of boys over to the other side of the table. When in combination with the WAR rule, which allowed you to make all of your Orcs fleet of foot once per game, it meant it was pretty easy for a transport-heavy Orc force to reliably pull off turn 2 assaults. Although, if you didn't actually scream when you declared it, you were quite frankly playing Orcs wrong. Plus, everything that wasn't a grot or a vehicle got Furious Charge, so they had a +1 strength and initiative when they charged. Although boys were only strength 3 at this point, so it's not quite as good as it would be now. And all this was before Overwatch was in the game, so armies based primarily on shooting like the Tau just had to hope they got the first turn so they had the time to blow up enough vehicles to keep the big bad green mushroom men away from them. The way custom force fields worked meant that they were also great for covering huge foot-slogging green tide armies, since the unit just had to be within 6 inches to benefit from a 5+ cover save, rather than having to be entirely within the force field's bubble as they do now.
Also on the big mech front, like most HQ choices, they were able to take a much wider variety of war gear, like this one that I built back in the day that has a burner and custom force field. They also got the much more interesting version of the warp-based Snotling hurling shock attack gun that existed before 8th. The current version is very streamlined and has the potential to hit like an absolute truck, but this one was more fun, albeit more complicated and dangerous to everybody at the table. When you fired it, you'd roll 2d6 to determine its strength, and depending on what you rolled, different things could happen. For example, on a double 1, the gun goes boom, removing the mech and anything else within 1d6 from play. On a double 5, the gun would malfunction and teleport the mech into melee with whoever he was firing at. And on a double 6, and I quote, "The tunnel opens a hole into the warp itself, and a ravening cloud of sentient demonic ichor gushes out into the material realm. Any model hit by the gun this turn is removed from play. Vehicles take an automatic penetrating hit." That is a large blast template attack, remember?
Then there were wound allocation shenanigans. Orc knobs were pretty tough in this book, with a lot of customization options. Now in 4th edition, when this was released, and indeed in most other editions of the game, if you have a multi-wound squad with different war gear and it takes damage, you select one model and take the damage on it until it's dead, then move on to the next model. When 5th edition rolled round, they did it a bit differently. You allocated wounds based on loadout, so if you had 2 wounds on this squad, you could place one on the ones with power claws and one on the ones with the combi scorchers, meaning no models could die regardless of any armor saves despite taking enough wounds to potentially kill one.
Where this got silly was if you had, say, 10 knobs, all with different loadouts, something you could easily do with this codex, that squad could potentially eat 11 wounds before a single model died. A unit that you could also give a pain boy to, so they had feel no pain, possibly give cyborg bodies to, so they had a 5+ invulnerable save, and put on war bikes, giving them a 4+ cover save from all the smoke they kicked up, and increasing their toughness by 1. So yeah, this was a time where diversified knob squads were used a lot, since they were also just good outside of this stuff. Also in here was the best vehicle upgrade. Vehicles could take red paint job for 5 points, which would mean that they could move 1 inch further per turn because, as we all know, red ones go faster. You may have noticed that all the vehicles of mine that have been shown in this video were red. This is not a coincidence. I know, I just think they're neat.
However, it wasn't all good. This codex had a big problem with dealing with heavy armor. Due to the way the game used to work, you needed at least a strength 8 weapon to even hurt something really tough like a Land Raider or a Monolith. And even then, you could only score a glancing hit. To have any chance of killing it quickly, you really needed a weapon of strength 9 or greater, and although orcs had plenty of power claws to do that in melee, at range they had nothing. Sure, shock attack guns and zap guns could potentially do it, but their strength was entirely random, so they weren't exactly reliable. The standard tactic to deal with such stuff, outside of power claw spam, was just to fit a death roller to all your battle wagons and just ram anything sufficiently heavy. A very orky solution, to be sure, but perhaps not the most elegant. And granted, to this day orcs don't really have much in the manner of ranged weapons that go above strength 8, but nowadays it is possible to plink a Land Raider to death with grot blasters if you have enough grots and enough dice, so it's not really an issue like it was back then.
Finally, taking a brief trip into the colour section of the codex, you'll find a lot of models that are still around, which is not entirely surprising considering that some of the current orc line is getting pretty old and, compared to some of the stuff we've covered, this book is relatively recent. Of the models that are not around today, the big ones that stand out are the buggies and tracks, which would only be replaced in 2018, as well as the old metal Death Dreads and Killer Can models. The Dreads looking less like a full-blown Death Dread and looking more just like a big Killer Can, which I guess they kind of are, but you know what I mean. Oh, and I suppose this is technically an old Gazkul model now too, although since he was only replaced sort of... Well, we don't actually know right now. We live in interesting times. But still, it feels weird to call it the old model. So I guess this bit is more for the people watching this video in 10 years' time. So, hello, I hope whichever Wasteland gang you joined is nice, and by the way, this is what the old Gazkul looked like. There's also a page of conversions, nothing too outrageous, but just enough to inspire you. And so it's one of those things that we'd like to see in the modern codexes too, especially in the Orc one, even if it's just a single page like this. It's a creative hobby, you know, revel in it.
And that was the 4th edition, but also kind of 5th edition, Codex Orcs. It was a fun book to use back in the day, and a fun one to revisit now, since it was one we've had a lot of experience with. Even if acknowledging it's old enough to go in this series does mean having to acknowledge that 2008 was indeed 12 years ago. I'm really sorry, I'm really having a lot of trouble letting that go.
And don't worry, I know we've just done a video on a faction that we've already covered, but that doesn't mean that we've forgotten about the other ones.
We just wanted something simple before... you know.
Next time it's the Lost and the Damned. Hey, we know this doesn't really have anything to do with the video proper, but we just wanted to say that we know that the world is a little bit scary right now.
Just try and remember to be safe, be kind, and take care of each other.